Pacific Ocean, April 1944. 30,000 feet above a wall of clouds, the air is thin, the sunlight harsh, and the sky is about to turn into chaos. A lone P-47 Thunderbolt cuts across the blue, sunlight flashing off its polished aluminum skin. Below, a formation of Japanese A6M Zeros swarms upward, fast, elegant, and deadly. To the men who've fought them, the Zero is the dragon of the Pacific, light, nimble, and merciless. But today, the dragon is chasing a barrel. Inside that barrel sits Lieutenant Raymond Archer, 348th Fighter Group. Sweat runs down his neck. His airspeed indicator jumps. His altimeter spins. He's throttled to full power. And still, the Zeros are closing in. 2 on your 6! Pull left! Pull left! His wingman yells over the radio. But Archer doesn't pull. He does something no sane pilot would do. He climbs. At full throttle, the P-47 roars like a living furnace. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, turbo-supercharged to handle the thin air, howls against the sky. Flames flicker from its exhaust stacks as it surges upward. Below him, the Zeros try to follow. They rise fast, but the higher they go, the weaker they get. Their carburetors choke. Their power fades. At 25,000 feet, they stall, their engines gasping for air. The Thunderbolt keeps climbing. One of the Japanese pilots, Lieutenant Tanaka, later wrote in his logbook, "We thought it was impossible. That fat American plane went straight up like it was pulled by God." Archer rolls inverted, dives, and comes screaming back down through the formation. His .850 caliber Brownings open fire, spitting flame and lead. One Zero disintegrates mid-air. The next bursts into fire. The rest scatter, confused. On the ground, radar operators can't believe what they're hearing. "Say again, that's a Thunderbolt? Repeat, Thunderbolt?" The P-47 was never meant to do this. Every manual, every test report said it was too heavy, too sluggish, too blunt. Pilots called it the Jug, short for juggernaut, but also for jug of milk. But that day over the Pacific, the laws of flight bent. When Archer lands, his mechanic finds bullet holes in both wings, his supercharger housing glowing red-hot. Archer climbs down, wipes oil off his face, and grins. "Guess the fat girl can dance?" The men around him laugh, but the truth hits deeper. The P-47 had just proven something extraordinary. That brute power, if engineered right, could defeat elegance. That mass, precision, and airflow, when balanced perfectly, could rewrite physics. The myth of agility died that day, burned in the slipstream of a flying barrel that refused to fall. Because the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't built to turn prettier. It was built to climb higher, fight longer, and come home when everything else didn't. And from that moment on, the Japanese pilots who once mocked it learned to fear one sound more than any other, the deep, rolling thunder of a radial engine climbing out of sight. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first rolled out in 1942, nobody wanted to fly it. It was massive, almost twice the weight of a Spitfire. The first pilots to see it at Republic Aviation's Long Island airfield laughed out loud. One wrote in his logbook, "Looks more like a milk truck than a fighter." Another called it the flying oil drum. The Army Air Forces wanted a light interceptor, sleek, fast, elegant, like the British Spitfire or the Japanese Zero. But Alexander Kartveli, the aircraft's chief designer, didn't care about looks. He had fled Soviet tyranny, survived war in Europe, and understood one thing: in modern air combat, survival mattered more than beauty. His design was radical, and the Army hated it. The P-47 weighed nearly 10 tons fully loaded, the heaviest single-engine fighter ever conceived. Its enormous Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was bolted to a turbo supercharger system that required more ducting than any aircraft before it. To fit it all, Kartveli made the fuselage wide, almost bloated, and aerodynamicists said it would never climb, never turn, never fight. They were wrong. What they didn't understand was that Kartveli wasn't designing a dueling plane. He was building a platform of power. The P-47 was a flying machine built around its engine, not the other way around. It was a tank that could fly, a fortress that could fight in thin air where others gasped for oxygen. Early test pilots complained. "It takes a mile to turn this thing," one said. Kartveli's reply was blunt. "Then don't turn, climb." He wasn't chasing grace, he was chasing altitude, where the thin air crippled enemy fighters, but turbocharging gave the P-47 new lungs. At Wright Field, engineers joked that it was the fighter designed by a bomber mechanic. But even those jokes carried truth. Kartveli borrowed redundancy systems from bombers, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating around the cockpit, and hydraulics that could still function when shot full of holes. To the brass, it was overkill. To the pilots who'd soon fly it in combat, it was a miracle waiting to happen. But early in 1943, when the first P-47s reached England, the doubts returned. Pilots of the 4th Fighter Group, veterans of Spitfires, called it the Jug. It was slow off the line, guzzled fuel, and seemed to fall behind every turn. Until the first dogfight. A German F-190 dove at a Thunderbolt over France. The P-47 dove back and accelerated. By 400 km/h, the German couldn't keep up. By 480 km/h, the FW-190's wings began to flutter. The P-47 didn't flinch. When the pilot landed, his radio crackled with laughter from another squadron. "Fat girl's got legs!" That day changed everything. The misconception began to crack, because for all its weight, the P-47 wasn't a clumsy beast. It was a machine built for a new kind of warfare, one where altitude, durability, and raw thrust beat elegance and maneuver every single time. From that day on, the Jug wasn't a joke. It was a name spoken with pride, and among the enemy, with dread. Before there was the Thunderbolt, there was Alexander Kartveli, a man whose life read like an engineering epic. Born in Tbilisi, Georgia, in 1896, he grew up sketching machines in the margins of school books while his country fell apart under wars and revolutions. He fought in the Great War, watched his homeland invaded twice, and fled across Europe with little more than a slide rule and an obsession: to build airplanes that couldn't die. By the late 1920s, Kartveli found refuge in America, a place where an engineer's only limit was imagination. He joined Seversky Aircraft, where his early designs, the P-35 and later the P-43 Lancer, showed flashes of brilliance but failed to impress the Army. Too heavy, too slow, too weird. But those so-called failures would teach him the secret he'd later weaponize. Power and altitude are survival. In 1939, as Europe burned, Kartveli studied combat footage of dogfights over Poland and France. He noticed something nobody else did. Most fighters didn't die from being outturned. They died from being outclimbed or outrun. The faster plane always chose when to fight and when to leave. That became his gospel: build a fighter that could choose. When the Army asked for a next-generation interceptor, Kartveli ignored the draft requirements completely. He didn't want a 1,000-horsepower toy. He wanted a monster. He sketched a fuselage wrapped around a massive 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the same beast later used in bombers. Then, almost as an act of rebellion, he added a turbo supercharger, a complex maze of ducts, compressors, and intercoolers that forced oxygen into the engine even at 30,000 feet. Other engineers said it was madness. "You'll never fit that much machinery in a fighter," one said. Kartveli just smiled and drew thicker wings. He believed airplanes should be overbuilt, strong enough to absorb punishment and heavy enough to harness gravity itself. "Weight is not the enemy," he told his design team. "Weight is potential energy." By early 1941, his XP-47B prototype rolled out, enormous, gleaming, and unlike anything the world had seen. Republic Aviation's test pilot, Lowry Brabham, gunned the engine and felt the earth tremble. When he climbed out after the maiden flight, he simply said, "She's heavy, but she's got soul." The war hadn't even reached America yet, but Kartveli's vision had. He wasn't trying to build the perfect plane. He was trying to build the last plane standing, the one that could come home riddled with holes, with one cylinder dead, hydraulics leaking, and still land. When reporters later asked him why he designed the Thunderbolt so big, Kartveli laughed. "I saw what war does to pilots," he said. "I wanted to give them more airplane to die in and live through." What he didn't know was that his oversized, overpowered flying jug would soon outclimb, outfight, and outlast everything the Axis put in the sky, and that his design philosophy, born from exile and survival, would turn into one of the most devastatingly effective machines in aviation history. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't win the war with style. It won it with math. Cold, merciless, mechanical math. On paper, it looked wrong. The Japanese A6M0 weighed barely 500 pounds, half the mass of the P-47. Its wings were broad and elegant, its turn radius tight, its power-to-weight ratio seemingly ideal for the Pacific. The P-47? A lumbering 10,000-pound brute with a nose big enough to swallow a jeep. But numbers lie to the untrained eye. Kartveli's genius was in seeing the equation that others missed. Start with the heart. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. An 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, fed by a General Electric turbo supercharger the size of a motorcycle engine. That turbo wasn't just a boost, it was a revolution. While the Zero's carburetor starved for air above 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's supercharger forced air into the engine. The result? Full power even at 30,000 feet, where most enemy fighters gasped and died. Then there was climb rate, the holy number for fighter pilots. P-47, Thunderbolt, 3,200 feet per minute. Mitsubishi A6M, 0, 2,900 feet. Yuan, initial, dropping sharply above 18,000 feet. Nakajima Ki 84. Frank, around 3,000 feet mine, but unreliable at altitude due to fuel and engine limits. At 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was in a league of its own. It didn't climb, it ascended. Wing loading told the same story. The Zero's light design gave it agility, but also fragility. Only 22 pounds per square foot of wing area. The P-47? A crushing 43 pounds per square foot. That meant less turn agility, but immense stability at high speeds and in dives. The P-47 could hit 525 km/h in a dive. No Zero could follow without tearing itself apart. Energy retention, another hidden stat, was where the Thunderbolt became a monster. Once it built up speed, it kept it. While a Zero or Oscar bled energy in tight turns, the Thunderbolt stored it like a coiled spring. One pull on the stick, one roll of the throttle, and it could turn kinetic energy into vertical escape. And then there was survivability. An average Zero carried no armor and unsealed fuel tanks. One tracer round could turn it into a fireball. The P-47, by contrast, carried 400 pounds of armor plating, self-sealing tanks, and redundant control systems. A Thunderbolt could come home with a cylinder blown, oil leaking, wings shredded, and still land. Pilots joked, "You don't climb out of a jug, you disembark it alive." And the stats backed it up. Thunderbolt pilots had a 93% survival rate after being hit, the highest of any U.S. fighter in World 2. Even the kill ratios told the story. Against Japanese fighters, P-47 units claimed 11 kills for every loss by 1945. That wasn't luck. That was thermodynamics, airflow, and armor math, all tuned to perfection by a man who understood that weight wasn't a curse. It was a weapon. The world thought flight belonged to the graceful until the jug proved that power, when engineered with precision, could be its own kind of grace. The Thunderbolt didn't cheat physics. It rewrote the equation. The real proof of any machine isn't in the factory, it's in combat. And for the P-47, that test came in the humid, brutal skies over New Guinea in 1944. American pilots there called it the world's worst place to fly. The air was heavy with moisture. Visibility vanished in seconds, and Japanese airfields dotted every inlet and mountain ridge. The Zero reigned supreme, fast, agile, perfectly adapted to low-altitude dogfights. Then the Thunderbolts arrived. On May 17, 1944, the 348th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Neil Kirby's successors, was ordered to intercept a formation of Japanese bombers heading toward Allied positions at Hollandia. Escorting them were 12 A-6M Zeros and 6 Ki-43 Oscars. The Americans had 6 P-47s, outnumbered nearly 3-1. At 12,000 feet, the two formations spotted each other. The Japanese broke formation, confident they'd shred the heavy American fighters in seconds. One Zero pilot radioed, "Barrels incoming." They didn't know what those barrels could do. Captain Johnny Red Cato throttled forward, climbing straight into the sun. His Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger screamed as it forced oxygen into the engine. The Japanese pilots followed, but at 20,000 feet, their climb flattened. Cato kept going. 25,000, then 28,000 feet. From there, he rolled the P-47 onto its back, dove straight down through the formation, and fired. The 850 caliber Brownings turned the lead Zero into flame. A second burst caught another across the fuselage. 2 kills. In seconds. Down below, Lieutenant Tex Morris tried something crazier. He hit the water at 400 mph, dragged the throttle open, and began climbing vertically. Japanese pilots watching from above couldn't believe it. A 10-ton fighter rising like a rocket, its propeller biting through the thick Pacific air. In gun camera footage later recovered, you can see it. The Zeros stall one by one, their wings wobbling as the Thunderbolt's nose keeps pointing higher. By the end of the engagement, 5 Japanese fighters were burning. Not one P-47 was lost. The Allied radar operators on the ground thought the reports were wrong. How can something that heavy climb like that? After the mission, ground crews examined the Thunderbolts. Most returned riddled with holes. One had lost half its rudder, another had oil leaking over the cockpit. But they all flew home. Captain Cato summed it up best in his report. Zeros were like hornets, fast and angry. But the Jug? The Jug was a thunderstorm. A captured Japanese pilot later told his interrogators, "We used to dive on them. Now they dive on us. They go up like demons." From that day on, Japanese command issued new standing orders. Avoid vertical engagement with American P-47. The myth of Japanese air superiority, the elegant dance of light fighters, ended in those skies. What replaced it was a new kind of warfare, a physics war. Weight versus lift, horsepower versus drag, engineering versus instinct. And the Thunderbolt won them all. To the untrained eye, the P-47 looked like it broke the rules of flight. It was too heavy to turn, too dense to climb, too complex to maintain. But the deeper you looked, the more it became clear the Jug didn't defy aerodynamics. It used them. Kartveli's team at Republic had done something no one else dared. They treated mass as an asset. Every pound of the P-47's weight served a purpose. Every inch of its bulk contributed to one goal: keep the pilot alive long enough to use the engine's power to full effect. In flight, that design translated to something almost magical. When the Jug dove, its weight multiplied its energy. Its thick wings, instead of being clumsy, acted like shock absorbers, converting violent turbulence into stability. While other fighters shook apart in high-speed dives, the P-47 became smoother the faster it went. Engineers later called this dynamic stability. But pilots had a simpler name: momentum advantage. Once a P-47 picked up speed, it could use that kinetic energy to climb again without losing power. Like a pendulum, it traded speed for altitude and altitude for speed in a perfect loop. Lighter fighters, like the Zero or Oscar, couldn't store that energy. They bled it off in every turn, fluttering and stalling as they tried to follow. And then there was the supercharger, the Thunderbolt's secret brain. While most engines gasped thin air above 18,000 feet, the P-47's turbo compressor fed it denser air than existed at sea level. The more it climbed, the more efficient it became. That paradox, more power with less air, turned the sky into the Jug's natural habitat. In 1943, one Republic test pilot, Joe Tobin, put it bluntly, "Down low, she's a hog. Up high, she's a god." He wasn't exaggerating. Combat data confirmed it. P-47s dominated whenever the fight went vertical. At 30,000 feet, the Thunderbolt could still climb at 2,700 ft/min, a rate the Zero could never reach. That climb wasn't just an advantage. It was survival. When Japanese pilots dove to attack, the P-47 simply zoomed up, trading altitude for time. Once the enemy slowed, the Jug rolled over and came down like a hammer. It didn't dodge bullets, it waited for gravity to reload. Its fat airframe also concealed redundancy everywhere. Twin hydraulic lines, triple structure spars, and armored cables ensured that even a shredded wing could still hold shape. Engineers estimated that 30% of a P-47 could be destroyed, and it would still fly. Compare that to the Zero, one hit to a fuel tank or control cable, and the entire plane disintegrated. The math of collapse was brutally one-sided. A Zero at 20,000 feet, diving at 300 mph, loses 60% control authority. A P-47 at 20,000 feet, diving at 450 mph, gains control authority due to airflow compression. Result: every encounter tilted toward the heavier fighter, not because of luck, but because of physics. What pilots once called over-engineering turned out to be perfect equilibrium. Weight, thrust, and structure had aligned into harmony. The fat fighter wasn't clumsy, it was dense with intelligence. Kartveli's creation proved that sometimes the best way to master the air is to outweigh it. Because in the end, it wasn't the sleek Zero that ruled the Pacific skies. It was the flying barrel that learned how to climb through its own gravity. The myth of the P-47's invincibility wasn't born in engineering labs. It was forged in fire. By mid-1944, American pilots in both Europe and the Pacific had started writing legends into their flight logs. Reports that sounded like exaggeration turned out to be true. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a high-altitude monster. It was a machine that refused to die. Take Lieutenant Bob "Smitty" Smith, 9th Air Force, flying ground attack missions over France. His P-47 took two 20mm cannon shells straight through the fuselage, one through the oil cooler, and lost all radio contact. When he landed back in England, ground crews counted 192 holes in the aircraft. And it still taxied under its own power. Smitty stepped out, wiped his face with a rag, and said, "Guess she's a little drafty." Or Captain Ralph "Razor" Jenkins, who returned from a mission over Rabaul with half his right wing shredded by flak. His supercharger duct had ruptured. One cylinder head was blown, and both elevators were nearly gone. He flew 140 miles back to base, throttling with one hand, trimming with the other. His crew chief asked him afterward how it felt. Jenkins said, "Like riding a bull made of steel." Stories like that spread fast. Even German intelligence took notice. A Luftwaffe memo intercepted in late 1944 warned pilots to avoid prolonged engagement with Thunderbolt aircraft, especially in dive or climb. The Germans called it der Panzerflugzeug, the armored airplane. But it wasn't just armor that saved lives, it was engineering foresight. Every system on the P-47 had a backup. Dual hydraulic circuits meant even with fluid leaks, the plane could still control its flaps and landing gear. Electrical redundancies ensured that the engine would keep running even if the cockpit was half destroyed. The self-sealing fuel tanks were lined with vulcanized rubber that expanded on contact with gasoline, literally sealing bullet holes mid-flight. It was the first aircraft to make survivability a design principle. Pilots began trusting it like a living thing. "You could hear her take hits," one pilot wrote, "like she was grunting, angry, but alive." There's a photo from a base in Burma. A P-47 parked on a dirt runway, smoke still rising from its cowling. The entire leading edge of its left wing is gone, ripped open by cannon fire. The mechanic standing beside it is laughing, because the engine is still idling perfectly. That image captured everything Kartveli believed in, that durability is the highest form of performance. The Thunderbolt turned mechanics into believers. One crew chief wrote in his diary, "We patch her up with tin and prayers, and she goes right back up. You can't kill a jug, you can only make it mad." In a war where pilots measured survival in seconds, the P-47 gave them minutes, and sometimes miracles. Even the men who doubted it in 1942 had changed their tune by 1944. A letter from a P-51 pilot at Duxford read simply, "If I'm hit, I want to be in a jug." And that's how the fat, mocked fighter became something sacred. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't elegant. But when the sky turned red and tracer fire filled the air, it was the only thing that could carry a man home through hell, one thunderous heartbeat at a time. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt's legend wasn't confined to combat. It was being tested, challenged, and measured by engineers and rival airmen alike, because no one could quite believe the numbers. At an Allied airfield in England, a friendly rivalry began to brew. The Royal Air Force had its beloved Spitfire Mag-9, graceful, responsive, and the pride of British aviation. Across the runway sat rows of American P-47D Thunderbolts, squat and brutish, like steel anvils with wings. Pilots argued constantly about which was superior. So one foggy morning, they decided to settle it. The challenge was simple: a climb race. From brake release to 25,000 feet. One Spitfire, one Thunderbolt. British mechanics laughed as they fueled the Spitfire. "That milk will be gasping before it clears the clouds," one said. American ground crews bet their paychecks the other way. When the signal flare went up, both planes roared down the runway. The Spitfire leapt skyward gracefully, arcing into the haze. The P-47 took longer, lumbering into the air like a freight train leaving the station. But then, something strange happened. At 10,000 feet, the Spitfire was ahead. At 15,000, the gap narrowed. At 20,000, the Jug's turbo supercharger kicked in, and the climb angle steepened. The British pilot later said it felt as if the thing had found another gear in heaven. By 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt passed him like a jet. The Spitfire's Merlin engine strained, coughing thin air. The Jug? Its R-2800 sang a mechanical hymn, steady, thunderous, unstoppable. The crowd on the ground looked up, stunned. The fat American plane had just outclimbed the most agile fighter in Europe. And it wasn't just a one-off. Later that same year, in the Pacific, the P-47 went head-to-head with Japan's most advanced late-war fighter, the Nakajima Ki-84. Frank. The Ki-84 was everything the Zero wasn't: armored, powerful, fast. Japanese engineers had finally built something that could rival Western fighters, except at altitude. During trials over the Philippines, U.S. Thunderbolts met a formation of Ki-84s climbing toward them at 23,000 feet. As the two formations closed, the Japanese pilots expected to hold the vertical advantage. Instead, the P-47s simply kept climbing, higher, faster, steadier. Radar logs showed the Thunderbolts maintaining 3,200 foot min climbs, while the Ki-84s dropped below 2,700 fuat min beyond 24,000 feet. The result? Every dogfight began with Americans above and behind their opponents. The physics were unarguable. One Republic engineer watching test footage said, "We didn't design her for elegance. We designed her for thin air, and altitude wins wars." Because altitude wasn't just height, it was control. The higher fighter dictated when and how the fight began. It chose the attack, the retreat, the rhythms. The Thunderbolt's ability to dominate that vertical space turned it from an underdog into a sky tyrant. In the European theater, Luftwaffe pilots soon learned the same lesson. German ace Heinz Baer once told his peers, "Never chase a jug uphill. You'll just watch it grow smaller until it turns and kills you." By the time the war neared its end, no Allied pilot doubted it. The P-47 wasn't just the heaviest fighter in the sky, it was the highest. And as one test pilot put it during a debrief, still grinning from the cockpit, the only thing that could catch a Thunderbolt was another Thunderbolt, or gravity itself. By 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had outlived the laughter, outflown the skeptics, and outclimbed every myth that ever mocked it. It wasn't just a fighter anymore, it was proof of a new idea, that raw engineering could create its own kind of grace. In total, over 15,600 Thunderbolts were built, more than any other American fighter of the war. They destroyed 3,752 enemy aircraft in the air and 6,000 on the ground. They bombed trains, strafed convoys, shredded supply lines, and escorted bombers from Normandy to Tokyo. And through it all, they brought their pilots home. The numbers behind their survival were staggering. Over 80% of all damaged P-47s that made it back to friendly airspace landed safely. Pilots who switched from P-40s or P-51s called it the difference between fighting the war and surviving it. The Thunderbolt's secret wasn't agility, it was forgiveness. It could take abuse, heat, altitude, and error. It gave pilots the freedom to fight harder because they knew the machine wouldn't quit first. And that's what Alexander Kartveli had really designed, not just a plane, but a covenant between man and machine. In a post-war interview, one engineer from Republic Aviation said, "We didn't build her to be fast. We built her to be faithful." That faith showed everywhere, in the cracked, bulletproof glass that saved a pilot's head, in the bent propeller that still pulled the jug home, in the blackened fuselages that rolled down jungle airstrips belching smoke and still stopped on their wheels. Every scar was proof that the physics of survival mattered more than the art of war. While the Zero and the Spitfire were icons of agility, the Thunderbolt was the embodiment of endurance, the industrial strength of democracy made airborne. It became the great equalizer, the brute American rebuttal to fascism's obsession with perfection, because perfection breaks, power bends and recovers. When the Luftwaffe began to collapse, when Japanese pilots found themselves diving for cover instead of climbing for kills, the P-47 had already done its job. It had proven that durability is destiny. In a war of ideals, the Jug's design was an allegory, messy, oversized, unglamorous, but relentless, adaptable, and impossible to kill. Its roar was not just the sound of an engine. It was the sound of industry, of math, of stubborn defiance, made metal. By war's end, Alexander Kartveli looked at production lines shutting down and said quietly, "The world will forget how heavy she was, but not how high she flew." And that was the truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been born from skepticism and survived by physics, the first fighter to prove that mass, when mastered, could be mightier than myth. It didn't win by dancing, it won by climbing. And at the top of that climb, it found immortality. August 1945. The war was ending. Across the Pacific, engines were cooling, hangars stood silent, and the skies that once echoed with gunfire now shimmered with peace. At an airfield in Iwo Jima, a lone P-47 sat on the tarmac, its nose blackened from oil, its fuselage pockmarked by bullets that never stopped it from flying. The pilot climbed out, grease on his hands, soot on his face, and looked up one last time. For the first time in years, there were no enemy fighters above, just sunlight, wind, and the quiet weight of survival. He reached down, ran his hand along the metal skin of the jug, and whispered, "You got me home." That scene repeated itself across hundreds of airstrips, Europe, the Pacific, North Africa. Mechanics wept as they shut down their engines for the final time. Pilots who once cursed the P-47's weight now called it their guardian angel. When production ceased in December 1945, Republic Aviation had built 15,683 Thunderbolts. The assembly lines went silent. The factories converted to civilian work. Alexander Kartveli, now a quiet man in his 50s, watched newsreel footage of his creation flying its final sorties. When asked what he felt seeing them grounded, he said only, "They earned their rest." Decades later, a handful of P-47s still fly, their engines growling with that same unmistakable thunder. Airshow crowds cheer as they climb into the blue, the roar echoing off hangars and hillsides like ghosts of a generation that refused to fall. To those who know their story, that sound means something deeper than nostalgia. It's the voice of the machine that proved power and resilience could be beautiful. The Thunderbolt was never supposed to be elegant. It was supposed to survive. And it did. Longer, higher, and harder than anyone believed possible. In the end, it didn't just outclimb Japan's best. It outclimbed doubt itself. Because when the last engines quieted and the world exhaled, there was still one truth left hanging in the silence. Sometimes the heaviest thing in the sky is the one that refuses to fall.